Hello everyone. My name is Katie and welcome to the SORTEE 2022 conference. Note that this session is recorded and will be later shared on our OSF meeting platform. Before I introduce our plenary presenter, I have a few announcements. We ask that all participants familiarize themselves, if you have not done so already, with our code of conduct available at sortee.org. After this plenary, there is one more workshop and then the conference conclusions. For more information on these events, please check the conference information pack. The Zoom links are in a Google Sheet, which you can also find in the conference pack or in the Shiny app. Please note that some discussions are also happening in Slack. Please see the conference information pack for information on how to navigate the Slack workspace. We hope that you have enjoyed the plenaries and interactive events of the conference so far, and have felt that you have been able to participate in sharing a more open, reliable, and transparent future for ecology and evolutionary biology. We are very excited for this final plenary of the conference. Now for a few details about this plenary. First, note that each of you can turn off or leave on the automatic captioning you see at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the live transcription button. We invite you to ask questions in the Q&A function of Zoom while the presentation is happening, and to upvote any other question you find of interest. After Martin has completed his presentation, I will select the questions from the Q&A in the order of the number of upvotes and read them to Martin. After about 15 minutes of Q&A, we will all leave the webinar and move over to a regular Zoom meeting. The link is available in the conference information pack, and my co-host will post it in the chat when it is time to migrate. In that other Zoom meeting, we will divide into breakout rooms to discuss the presentation and to interact with the presenter in small groups. Remaining questions that haven't been addressed during the Q&A can be posted in the Slack channel dedicated for this plenary, and discussions from the post-plenary mixer can be continued there. Now for our presenter. Martin Westgate is the head of science and decision support for the Atlas of Living Australia, Australia's largest database of biodiversity observations. He was previously a research fellow at the Australian National University, where he also obtained his doctorate in landscape ecology and conservation biology. He is also a scientific programmer in R with substantial experience in package development, statistical analysis, and data visualization. As a graduate from the Environmental Science School at ANU myself, I have found ALA to be an invaluable resource, both for while completing my undergraduate coursework and now in the world of ecological consulting. So I'm very excited to learn more from Martin about his work at ALA, and specifically how he has managed the trade-offs involved with maintaining and enhancing the usefulness of this incredible database to better support the biodiversity informatics community. So with that, I will give it over to Martin.
Lovely, thank you, Caitlin, and thanks also to the organisers for inviting me to this conference. It's a real privilege to be invited to give a plenary, and I've been very interested in the work of SORTEE for some time, so to have that kind of recognition is a real privilege. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Canberra today, which is the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and so I'd like to give my respects to their elders past and present. Yeah, so the title of this talk here, 12 Years of Open Science Infrastructure, a little misleading in the sense I've been at the ALA for only a couple of years. So I guess more what this is about the relationship between scientific infrastructure and scientific research, as I see it. Other people may have different perspectives. And I'm drawing on my work, but those are the rest of the Atlas, and particularly my team, the Science and Decision Support team here at the ALA, which we've built over the last 2 years. So look, a little bit about me. So I started out at the Australian National University doing a PhD on frog ecology. Feel free to ask me questions about frogs. I haven't been in the field a long time, but I just love talking about them. So happy to talk about that any time. I ended up spending 12 years at the ANU as a PhD student, postdoc, research fellow. And over that time, I did a lot of research, but it also coincided with the time where R became especially dominant in ecology and evolutionary research as a method for doing analysis. And then, of course, so much more for communication, for reactivity and shining and things like that. When I started learning R, it was 2007, you know, a time before RStudio existed, before the tidyverse existed. I learned it from a set of scripts that my honors supervisor gave me, you know, so that world has changed a lot. And the work that I did in that space was obviously on ecology, ecological modeling, but also an interest in evidence synthesis research, which led to me developing work called RevTools, which is for summarizing scientific information using text mining, and also led to some collaborations that, including the evidence synthesis hackathon, which I established with my colleague Neil Hadaway back in 2018, and it's still doing some stuff. So checking that stuff out if you want a history lesson or to see some interesting work. But so that's my sort of backstory. A lot of this talk is going to be opinions, and this is where that really gets started. So my experience of being a researcher in a university, initially as a PhD and then as an employee, I guess is this, is that there's a real emphasis, particularly in the early years, on agility, innovation, novelty. The ability to publish papers quickly, obviously, is one aspect of that, but also the need to be recognized by one's peers by generating novel, I guess we'd call them discoveries or insights. The longer I was employed at ANU, the more I realized the sort of structural aspects of being an academic as well. The fact that most projects are either built as short-term things, even if the intention is that they'll become long-term. So where I've seen long-term monitoring programs work in ecology in Australia, for example, that have come out of academic labs, they're still strung together from short-term funding. And there's also, I guess, in Australia and overseas, a structural emphasis on projects being short-term and outsourcing to people like postdocs and PhD students. At least Australia's in a situation where they pay their postdocs fairly well. In overseas, it seems that that's a cost-saving measure as well as one that drives innovation. But to some extent, these are stereotypes, obviously. You know, different institutions are able to do different things. I have seen really successful long-term projects come out of universities, obviously, and I'll talk about some of those later on. But nonetheless, these structural factors do exist within academia. I don't think I'm entirely making them up. And they lead to some slightly odd situations. So this is a fairly old quote now, coming up on 7 years, but it's from a paper where some people did some text mining in the medical literature and found that the word novel was increasing at such a rate that by the year 21-23, every paper would include the term novel, questioning the meaning of the word at that point. And this was one of a suite of terms that were being used to gain traction with editors and peer reviewers to make that work easier to publish. And clearly responding to the fact that that was a trait in published research that was deemed as being favorable. So clearly there's some external evidence that novelty is highly valued in academia. Which leads us into a situation where we are some years later now, where the open science movement has gained some traction, almost not quite in response to that, but in parallel. So obviously, if you're going to have a system that emphasizes novelty and speed and high productivity in terms of numbers of publications, that can play against quality, and there's use cases that I won't need to remind this audience about, where those have led to some quite serious problems in the quality of that science. And so I think things like pre-registration, preprint servers are a necessary response to that. And it's really shared data, shared code, all these sorts of things are very positive and important developments that are necessary for improved science in future, especially as we become more dependent on technology for our data collection, our analysis, all that sort of stuff. Of course, that's simultaneously becoming easier as it seems to me the field is becoming more tech literate. And not just our field, but science in general. it wasn't unusual when I started to meet researchers who had no statistical training whatsoever, who didn't know what a programming language was, or rather wouldn't know how to use one. And that's, I would argue, in new graduates, a rarity these days. Simultaneously, the platforms that are used to literally be best for statistical analysis and plotting, and now you can use it for all your communication, your data sharing, everything. So those tools have themselves become more useful. Of course, the fact that places like SORTEE exist to advocate for open science principles shows it's not a trivial exercise to embed these processes. And I do think there are large changes that are still needed. The argument I'm going to make today, or the first of two or three, is that it seems to me, because of these necessary changes, that open science is in a transition to a more infrastructure-dependent model. If you're going to require people to pre-register, you need a platform to pre-register. If you need someone to share code, you need a platform for it. Now, this is a fairly obvious statement. I'm in some ways several years behind the zeitgeist in saying this, so this won't be controversial. But these are not things that were traditionally associated with the academic system, or at least in my initial perception of them. And just in case people need someone else's word for it, this came out 3-4 days ago. While I was writing this talk, Brian Nosek talking about the fact that they're trying to move to a more an ongoing funding model that meets their goals for the Centre for Open Science, rather than single projects. And I think that's a generic move. So coincidentally, my experience in infrastructure comes from having moved to the Atlas of Living Australia 2 years ago. For those who aren't aware, there are a series of living atlases around the world. These are websites, but also databases. This is our homepage. Literally, they store observations of plants and animals from museums, collections, researchers, apps. Many of you will be familiar with these. If you haven't, please check us out. There are a series of us around the world. This is the ones that I was able to get data on quickly. There are more in various stages of development. And as you can see, Australia has had the ALA for 12 years. We're one of the earlier living atlases. We made our code available online very early and then built a program to share that code around the world. And so a lot of the other infrastructures that are listed here use our code. Or have adapted our code to be able to build their infrastructure. These are now nodes in a global organization called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, which now stores over 2 billion records. So a very valuable resource for people who wish to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of biodiversity across the planet. So that's cool, that's a benefit. But there's also challenges to running an infrastructure like ALA. And I'm not going to focus I'm not going to try to focus specifically on the ALA too much. I'm trying to generalize this message. But just to take an example of a single project, if I were still in university, I wanted to collect data, I would simply find a way to fund it, I suppose, is the hard bit. But then collecting data itself, other than through a health and safety lens, is a fairly straightforward exercise. I could customize the way I wanted the data to look, how I collected it, how I stored it, how I analyzed it. Effectively infinite freedom around how that data is structured within the confines of what's sensible for answering the questions that I have. Those things are not true for somewhere like the ALA. So we don't collect our own data. We work with other institutions. Those institutions store data in a way that's convenient to them and not necessarily to us or to each other. So all our data collection is through relationships and networks. We work with an established data standard that I had not seen in scientific research before moving to the ALA. It's called the Darwin Core Standard, which in some ways is quite straightforward, just says a place and a time and some very sensible things that tell you about what that observation is and how it was collected. And there's nothing crazy about that, but it is nonetheless a novel computational structure. And that means it has its own, needs its own systems to work effectively. People need to be able to translate into it, translate out of it. There needs to be a committee to work out how that system should change over time. These are slow processes to build. Similarly, ways of getting data in and storing data and getting data out all require careful building and maintenance. Every step in there needs work and maintenance. So I just wanted to point out that if you're thinking just about the data from a single project, then there is a huge overhead in getting that data in somewhere like the Atlas. The benefit, which I'll talk more about later on, is that scales. And so in theory, you do this work once or twice, and then you can populate it across many institutions. And that's effectively the model that the ALA and other atlases, including GBIF, have been able to capitalize on. So just to say that, yeah, the benefits are stability and scalability. So the major point that I'd like to make then during this talk is that, in my view, while you might see them as entirely distinct processes, stability and innovation are in fact codependent processes that are happening within science at all times. And I just want to walk through a few examples of why I think that's the case. Like I said, when I came to the Atlas, I felt like innovation was really where all the work that I'd gone had been into innovating new concepts, and the things I've learned about stability, I think are potentially worth sharing here. And I guess it builds on some quite long traditions. So the idea that information can be reliably transmitted through time and stored in places like libraries, museums, collections, universities, is an ancient one, right? This is not a new concept. The idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants as scientists is itself an old quote attributed to Newton. Now, so that's an obvious one. I guess the process by which observation occurs, we make an assumption in science that to be valid, an observation has to be repeatable, which suggests that the world is stable enough to be observed. But I guess also the example here of the Large Hadron Collider shows that working together to build infrastructure for observation can lead to insights that would otherwise be impossible. Now, in some ways, that's an odd choice for this talk. There are many examples where the same has been true for ecological observation, for example, where that is to say, the insights that have been generated through collaboration, through working together in a consistent way, have been much greater than the sum of their parts. Just for the R users out there, there'll be more talking about that later on, but this is a screenshot from the Wayback Machine of CRAN, I think in 2003, 25th of January 2003, and this is it today. Effectively the same web page with a different logo. The benefit of having a stable infrastructure there is vast. I would argue that a lot of the insights that ecology and evolution have made over the last decade are due to the stability of the R programming language, which is an amazing thing, right? I mean, it looks really retro, but that in that stability is utility, and I think it's very easy to ignore that. And finally, I guess stability in modes of communication, the fact that the first edition of the Philosophical Transactions from 1665 is still recognizable as the same format of journal that we see today, is itself an incredible feat of stability that has enabled a large amount of growth in science. It has, of course, got its own problems. So let's not get too deeply into the benefits or otherwise of this current scientific publication system, but nonetheless, it has had its successes. So that's just to make the point that stability has value for the scientific endeavor. The rest of what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that working across this boundary between stability and innovation is not straightforward. And I don't think this will be particularly shocking to people, particularly not those attending this conference, but nonetheless, I hope that these insights have some value. So some of the things that we've seen at the Atlas are things like shift in baseline syndrome, something that is initially deemed as revolutionary and insightful, can sometimes within months or certainly years come to be seen as mundane. And I think that comes from trying to serve a research community that is so innovative that it can quite quickly use up the intellectual capital of something like the Atlas, where newer insights become harder to generate. And so the desire to see innovation in your platform is always there. Corresponding with that then is a challenge of managing the pace of change. Some users will want will want new features all the time. Those add a maintenance burden that prevent you from maintaining a stable service. Some users, if you try and turn off old software, even if they're the only user, will be furious. And so there's no easy win there. The problem that we're increasingly, or that I'm increasingly coming into contact with, is that something like a piece of computational infrastructure requires people with different skills just to exist. So the living atlases, for example, they're literally websites. You can visit them. They're also databases. They also have an API. They also have a scientific application. So to understand the questions that are being asked of your platform or that will be in future, you need a science background. There are very few people who can speak across these domains. I am not one of them in terms of having all the conceptual background that I would need to be fluent in each aspect of that. And like I say, very few people do. So maintaining stability requires talking to people, and that's hard. So I'm going to walk through an example now of where we've tried to balance and some trade-offs between these processes. I'm going to pick one that I was quite familiar with. This is a piece of software called Galar, which is an R package for getting data out of the ALA. And I'm fairly sure there'll be some R users in the audience. I hope that those who don't use the ALA or use R still gain something out of this, but I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive on this specific example and then draw some conclusions at the end that I hope are more general also. So Galar is the successor to a piece of software called ALA for R. Itself an R package. It was released in 2014. At that point, one of the only R packages that was capable of getting large-scale downloads of biodiversity information. It was not only groundbreaking, but also very flexible. You could do a lot of things with it. And I think that reflects the fact there's a lot of APIs that it could draw upon, and it could do that very efficiently. So just to show, this is the API page as it was then and remains to this day. There are dozens of these. These are all different endpoints that you can hit, and you can say, oh, I want to, do a particular task. I'm going to keep scrolling for a bit. This is the full list of tasks, and within these, there's many ways to customize each API call, of course. That gives you a vast number of options as to how to interact with the ALA from an API and therefore through a package like ALA for R. That was enormously useful at the time it was developed. Maintaining something that complex is challenging. So, and conventions that are in place and standardized now were not in place in 2014. So, for example, ALA had a series of problems with naming conventions. Some were full words that were human readable, some were abbreviations of those words, some were in snake case, some were in camel case. Things that we're quite used to dealing with now and managing out were not dealt with at the time. Also had this is getting a bit detailed, but just to underscore those lessons. Because there were so many APIs that could be called, the number of names becomes a problem. So there's actually a bunch of functions that look the same, but actually do different things. ALA list and ALA lists being clear examples that do, I won't go into the details, but they do entirely different things. Beyond the function names, the argument names were equally confusing, or perhaps more so. There may be some users who recognize the abbreviation WKT as well-known text, which is still a fairly standard geographic format, albeit quite a low-level one. I doubt there's many people who know what FQ is an abbreviation for a QA. More confusing was the fact that that ALFR required you to parse what are called Solr queries. So Solr is a way of calling data in the same way as like, oh gosh, it doesn't matter too much. The point is, it's a way of specifying queries that filter the amount of data you get, and they're required to be passed verbatim in Solr syntax from R. And so you'd have to do things like quote out these quotation marks and things. Very unusual for an R user to have to do that. And finally, there was a behavioral problem. So most functions return a data frame. Tibbles didn't exist at the time it was built, so that's okay. But some returned lists, some returned PDFs that were generated on the website. There's a lot there. These are, again, things that are not done anymore. And so we rebuilt ALFR as Galar to be opinionated interface to the ALA. So not to query everything, but just query things we thought were most important in a standardized way, and to update it to modern style standards, including using pipeable syntax based off a tidyverse sort of model, and I guess underneath that sort of SQL. So just to walk you through, so the rest of this makes a bit of sense. So there's three types of things the Atlas that Galar does. It enables you to look up information, what sort of fields we index, what they you can search them, you can show all of them. Then you can there's a set of functions prefixed with Galar that do standard tidyversy type things: filter, reduce the number of rows, select, reduce the number of columns, group by is a way of specifying columns to group your results by. I'll walk through some examples of these afterwards. And then once you're done, you can run a query to return the type of information you want. So that might be the number of records or species. It might be to literally return all the records themselves, or it might be that to return things like images or sounds. And those are all prefixed with the word Atlas. So just to give an example, if you wanted to find the number of records, the way the workflow for this works is you initially say, I want to run a call or a query. A standard thing is to narrow that down to a particular taxonomic group. In this case, we've chosen Galans just because it's, the package name. And then finally, you'd say what kind of query you want to run. In this case, I want some counts, and it just returns that as a tibble. Everything gets returned as a tibble in Galar, with one exception, which is taxonomic trees are returned as something different because they're tree-like, and tibbles don't support that natively. So obviously, you can narrow that down in several ways. So in addition to having a taxonomic group, you might want to filter by different things such as year or the person who provided that information. Obviously, the count is lower in this instance. You might want to group by one of those facets. In this case, we just said, give me counts by year. You can group by multiple fields simultaneously as well in recent versions. And this is a slightly more involved example, but just to show how relatively straightforward it is to transform that from just getting a summary to getting the original records. This requires that you provide login information that you've registered with our website. The other living atlases have the same requirement, but then the call is effectively the same. A taxonomic group filter. You could use Galar select if you wanted as well. In this particular instance, we do a little bit of mapping of some data from the OSMAP package, and then simply plot with ggplot, and you get something like this. So a comparatively very straightforward modular workflow that people can adapt to their own needs to get the information they want and interrogate that data. Something that is in the current version but is getting greatly expanded is the capacity to call other atlases. We're working exactly on the syntax for this. This version will continue to work, but we might do something a bit more sophisticated down the track. But basically, to be the ability to switch atlases at will between the ones that are supported by Galar, of which we're expecting there'll be about 10 or 12 in the next version. And then you can get those counts. So you saw some of these numbers in a previous table, for example. Because we chose to make Galar in such a way, I mentioned earlier on, it was opinionated and didn't call every API. That meant choosing what Galar should do. And Galar basically is now a package that downloads data and nothing else. Previously, it would plot things, it would build field guides. Doesn't do any of that stuff now. If you want to build your own field guide, do it in R Markdown. If you want to do your own plot, use ggplot2. Now, because we've reduced the innate capacity of the package to do that, we wanted people to have examples of how to do it. And so we've generated ALA Labs, which is a web page, literally labs.ala.org.au, where you can see examples of other types of analysis or visualization that you may wish to do with the Atlas, but are not supported by Galar. So we do this in the form of posts where you can, they're quite visualization heavy at the moment, but we'll expand it to statistical analysis at some point in the future. You can navigate by taxon or type of plot, and you can, for each one of these, it gives you a worked example. So you can show real code. So in terms of what we learned from that redevelopment process, which is incidentally ongoing. We're still working on Galar, and we had one major revision already since we launched it in response to feedback. So I think there's never going to be a point where we stop. And it's the same is true with other features of the Atlas as well, where we're continually trying to improve our user our performance for our users within the limits of the budget and time that we have. So I think something that was really important was to articulate why we wanted to change ALA for R and highlight that it was getting to the point where it was outliving its usefulness. It was causing more of a burden than a benefit. I think making that argument very clearly and strongly and letting people know that that was what we're doing and why was really useful. I've emphasized here that it builds on paradigms that are now standard, so standard styles of coding in R, but that doesn't follow that it was obvious that that was how this system should work. There's still a need for creativity in infrastructure in general, I suppose, as well with code development. Not a term necessarily that people associate with software, but I think is very strongly there. And so this challenge between trying to do something creative that will be genuinely useful without imposing too high a cognitive burden on your users, where they have to do a lot of work to learn how something functions, is a real challenge, and not one that I kind of anticipated. To me, as someone who is quite opinionated about how things should look, I thought we're going to get this right first time and it'll be great, and that simply wasn't the case. So I think there's always a need to balance other people's expectations with your own and listen to feedback. Without listening too much to feedback, ironically. We have had requests from people to get rid of this and bring back old ways of coding, to add features that are redundant or support quite odd and perhaps mistaken workflows. We've had annoyance from users simply for having done this. And I think a lot of that is quite fair. It is disruptive to people's workflows. And people have been working with the Atlas for a long time. And it's wrong to disregard that. But it also, to maintain two entirely separate R packages that do different things is a very high maintenance burden. We simply can't achieve it. So listening openly and carefully to what people want and need, but still making a reasoned decision and being able to explain that decision that doesn't disregard people, but also doesn't just do as you're told, is a real challenge. Broader lessons, I think, have come out of this for me as a process, and in 2 years into my journey at the Atlas. I was really excited by this fail quickly method that you get a lot in a research setting, where you try something out, you see if it works. Oh, it doesn't work, we'll stop doing it. I think the ALA and other infrastructure facilities can learn from that. I think that's a really useful thing. It's not new to them. People have done that a lot here and continue to, but it is a useful paradigm and we tend to forget it. I think conversely, succeeding slowly, picking something that is just generically useful and is worth investing in, and just keeping doing it to keep your users so they know what to expect and they know the benefits they're going to get from your work. I think that also has merit, and it's one that's still difficult to achieve in academia, despite clear examples where, as I mentioned earlier, collaboration and long-term investment and it has delivered enormous benefits. I think in both systems, so at the ALA as part of a research infrastructure, as opposed to a research center which might be based in a university, but they have different reward systems, but there's also the potential for people to work just to those reward systems in both places. Mentioned earlier on and many others have discussed the issues with selection towards smaller or less important papers, the prioritization of novelty over importance in academia, the way that academia is locked into a publication system that is expensive and yet delivers few benefits, are examples of power structures and reward systems that are hard to break. And similarly, most people who work at the Atlas spend most of their time writing code and not in using the data itself for analysis in the same way that their users do. And so our reward structures are distinct from our users. And that can mean you get caught in a loop here too. And so this isn't an attempt to assign blame, or it's just to acknowledge that reward systems have real effects on the systems that on the work that people do. And the way around that, I think, is communication. So to stop yourself being an echo chamber, just talk to people who are different from you and who use your system. As I mentioned earlier on, there's no easy win to how quickly or how slowly to develop new ideas, how quickly or slowly to turn off old software, all that sort of stuff. There's no risk-free way through these questions. You're probably going to inconvenience someone. If you're having any kind of impact, any decision you make will also have an impact, and therefore there's no risk-free path. I hope that doesn't sound pessimistic. I think it's just a feature of the system. So just to summarize my points, I think the open science system, if such a thing exists, is becoming more infrastructure dependent. I think that's inevitable. I think that's probably a good thing. I think there's systems that are more stable and systems that are more innovative, codependent in science. I think they each have very important roles to play. And working to capitalize on the benefits of both systems, I think is difficult, but a worthwhile exercise. So I'm going to stop speaking there and take time for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin.
No worries.
So we'll just wait a minute to see if any questions pop in. But in the meantime, I just found sort of near the end there that idea of fail quickly versus succeed slowly quite fascinating. I've not really come across that that sort of idea before. So I was wondering if you could expand a bit on when you think one might be more appropriate than another.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, right? I guess it's like many things, trying to keep a strategic mindset and a focused mindset in mind at any one time is challenging. I think while we were redeveloping Galar, we'd sort of alternate between the two. We'd come up with great ideas and then realize that they made the syntax impossible to explain to people, and so we'd throw them away. And I think in that sense, many new idea generating projects, whether it's for grants or for software or whatever, go through that sort of brainstorming phase. Failing quickly is something I'm quite familiar with. I did that sort of a mode of thinking that I find really appealing. Just throw everything out there and whittle it down. Other people prefer to sort of take an idea and really workshop it, and I think it's just temperamental, really. Whatever works for you. The succeeding slowly, I guess, is the logical corollary to it, and so that's why I put it in there. But it's not something you see written down, right? And yet I do think it works. Things like, I put the Large Hadron Collider in there. I have no insights into how that got funded or generated or whatever, but I have seen a lot of ecological monitoring programs that have just slowly succeeded. And people who had a long-term vision but knew they weren't going to get 20 years of funding. And so they were just like, no, well, next year we'll do this. And then if that works, the next year we can argue this. And just plugging away at it and putting the work in. And there's maybe a dozen examples of that across the country, where people have done monitoring programs piecemeal, that are piecemeal in the sense of how they were funded, but not how they were thought through, and not how, and you can look back on them and they are perfectly consistent. You can establish trends over a long period of time, which leads to insights that you wouldn't otherwise be able to generate into the status of Australia's biodiversity. I think that's an example of just slowly succeeding at things, just winning without noticing, or without necessarily everyone else noticing. So I think it's important to recognize the very strong value of that. I also think that who was it? It might have been Hadley Wickham saying that good infrastructure is invisible. I think that's often true as well. So he was talking there, I think, about the tidyverse syntax and how to make R a more usable program. But I think the same is true of places like the ALA and GBIF. we have people who like us and we have people who say that we don't do enough new, interesting work. And, both are probably true. It's not that one's right or one's wrong, but we do tend to become, we stop paying attention to things that just work consistently. People don't talk about Google or the internet or, things that, or literal plumbing, right? Things that help you every single day just disappear from your scope. And I think that doesn't mean they're not useful. And I think it's just kind of nice to put a plug in for the people who are just working day in and day out. Like we literally have techs who built the Atlas who are still here 12 years later. And they're not on this call, but that doesn't mean that their work wasn't valued.
That's a really good point. I like the idea that potentially the highest compliment you could have working for an institution like that is that your work goes unnoticed because nobody has problems with it.
Yeah, and it was actually quite astounding to me. So we're an organization that's probably, when I joined, we were probably about 30, 35 people. We're up to about 50 now because we've had a lot of projects lately that required more staff. We may slim down again, I'm not really sure. The amount of work that goes into keeping a website running and keeping its services going is enormous and is invisible. And overhauling 12 years of technical debt in such a way that it doesn't break anything is a really hard problem. I'd hate to do that with my own code, and yet people do it here routinely. It's quite amazing.
Right. I have a question in the Q&A. Shinichi is wondering, what is the relationship between ALA and a high-level database such as Flora of Australia?
Yeah, I don't know Flora of Australia. That one I can't answer. I mean, look, we're part of a sort of biodiversity informatics landscape, I guess is what I'd say. So just to put that in context, we're the local node for GBIF. So we speak to 900 different data providers, some of whom are individuals, some of whom are places like the Australian Museum that have dozens of employees, some of whom are researchers. There's a huge diversity. Some of them are apps like BirdLife or eBird or iNat that might have 1 million users, more than that. So there's a huge diversity of size and style and type. We communicate with them often one-on-one, like literally we have a point of contact and we email them every month, or some of the things are automated, but fewer than you'd think. And we work with them to bring our data in. We work with the global node GBIF to bring our data up. We work with our sister nodes to make sure that their infrastructure is, because a lot of them build on our code base, we help them with their maintenance and stuff. So that, what was it? The UK has 200 million observations there, more than Australia, but they only have 3 staff or something. So, so we work with them to maintain their infrastructure. And then there's things like, there's a bunch of partner organizations that do things like governance and standards. The obvious ones, I suppose, are taxonomics. There's places like Australian Faunal Directory, Plant Names Index, places that are responsible for determining what the current names are for plants and animals in Australia, and that forms the backbone of our whole system. So yeah, there's a vast network of connections to other organizations that do related things that we try and integrate technically, but also literally just to be aware of each other in that work. And that's what's really keeping the system running. And just like with I was mentioning technical debt and writing code earlier on, those networks are effectively invisible to the user, I expect, and in some cases hope. The idea is that it just works and you don't have to think about it. But in practice, it does take a lot of time and money and people to keep those relationships going.
Right, and Shinichi was also wondering, can the nice tutorials created by ALA be used for teaching without any restrictions?
Yeah, go on. So particularly, I imagine that's about ALA Labs. I mean, that's effectively what it's for. So it's supposed to be reproducible. You can use it yourself. At some point, we might DOI them. Like we just didn't in the first instance. and I'm not sure we wrote a license on them. We could probably change that tomorrow. But the intention is that they're for free use. Yeah, they're having a, maybe it's just a personal view. I don't think we have an institutional position on this, but, you know, having a code literate user base is a wonderful thing. Like if there's more people who can make use of our service in a more advanced way, like what a win. So if people want to use that in teaching, whatever, go right ahead.
Oh, that's fantastic. I was also wondering with what you mentioned at the beginning, how an individual researcher just at their institution coming up with a research question that they want to answer, they can just design their data collection, fieldwork, etc., completely the way they want to, and that suits them. But you have this amazing challenge of having to not be at all in control of that whatsoever and be getting data from all different sorts of sources and in different formats. And how do you manage the credibility of some of the data if you can't quite be sure that it wasn't actually collected in a way that's very...
It's really hard, isn't it? And in some ways it's a question of policy and governance, right? Rather than, there's no way to know for sure what someone's standards are, whether they're the same as yours, what's good enough, all that sort of stuff. Historically, it's also worth bearing in mind there's different kinds of information. So there's a lot of situations where museums and collections, like botanic gardens are a good example of this, right? Like someone photographs a non-native species in a botanic gardens. It does exist there, it's planted there, it's labeled, but it's not from there. Who's wrong in that instance? And this hits us a lot, where people go, I'm trying to model the distribution of this species. Like, well, you know, it's not untrue to say that that plant exists in that place. So it's not, and I say that not to make an excuse about data quality or lack thereof, but just to highlight that there are, these are real problems. If someone's going to provide us literally their database of things that is in their collection, then it's going to show stuff like that every now and then. Things that are extinct and don't occur somewhere anymore, that sort of stuff is another example. So historically, the policy of the Atlas was we're here as an aggregator, but not a curator. You know, there are experts within each institution who make a choice as to whether they think that a species has been labeled properly and if the location is correct, and then we just take it and share it with people. That puts large restrictions on the utility of that data for other applications. It also ignores the fact that we actually do quite a lot of curation. You know, we know that even some simple tests, someone said, like, there's a few that we've run ourselves, like, someone said this plant is in Australia, but actually the location is in Japan, you know, that sort of stuff. It's pretty easy to computationally check for that, and we do. And we're trying to get better at it too, so come up with new tests that ping out outliers and things like that. And then there's things that we purely curate. We decide what spatial layers we index, we decide who to trust there, we decide, it needs a bit of work, but we have a system for keeping expert distributions within our system, which are literally just like often hand-drawn historically, but now a bit more computational outlines of where species are known to exist. And you could map those against the points and see what's an outlier by that definition as well. So we curate those in the sense we choose people who do and don't get indexed. The question is how far you go towards curation versus just display. And that's a constant flux for us. At the moment, we're in the early stages of a first project to curate actual data points, where we are working with academics who have done filtering processes and said, these records correct, these ones we think are wrong, and in these ways, these are taxonomically incorrect, these ones are in the wrong location, whatever. We're testing some ideas for bringing that information back into the Atlas. And that would be, I think, I don't think that would ever lead to us deleting records. I think it's always useful to show people what the raw data is, but it might be that in future we say, oh, look, these people have affirmed the value of this information for this function. which might be species distribution modeling, but might be some other function. Whereas these ones are not validated or perhaps in need of further investigation. I think we'll expand that in future, but it's very much in a test phase, which is funny, right? We're 12 years in and still learning things, but I think it's good to try and keep growing. Sorry, that was a very long answer, wasn't it? It could have been quite a simple question.
No, that was great. I've wondered that in the past, because I can imagine that there's sort of a trade-off in a way between including more data for completeness, but then also once it's been included, then maybe it's harder to sort of later for someone to go back and separate what they would consider acceptable versus not acceptable or suited to their purposes or whatever it is. So
yeah, look, it's a huge problem, and it's the one that hits us most. Like, if you got 112 million records like we do, like today, try downloading that. Never mind reading it and curating it. And in a sense, that's a bit of a silly thing to say. Of course, no one's going to read through that line by line. There's a lot of tools we've got that could help you with that process. And I'm not trying to dismiss that that's possible. But there's diminishing returns, right? So you could probably knock 10, 25, 50% of obviously wrong records out fast. Days, weeks, maybe only months of work. Try knocking 90%, 98%, 99%. Those last errors are going to be really hard to spot. And they're going to require not just time or effort or new algorithms, but new data, So there's at the moment at CSIRO, we're digitizing our national herbarium. That leads to the potential for AI on things like leaf traits. That leads to the option of things like detecting whether something has been misclassified because its traits cluster elsewhere from its taxonomic name. That's millions of dollars of investment in cameras, in people's time, in databasing, in AI, just to get to a point where you can automatically pick a taxonomic error in one taxonomic group. It's not going to work on mammals. So you see my point. Effectively, the horizon on effort is for getting every point correct is vast. And it's a similar thing in other fields, taxonomy, for example, where we're trying to name everything, and it's going to take us a long time.
Well, speaking of taxonomy, another question we have is, what is the source of your taxonomic information and when it gets updates? Example, number or species name, when the species name changes.
Yeah, so this is something we're working on. So the simple answer is there's a markdown document somewhere in our GitHub. We have like 200 GitHub repositories, so it gets a little hard to follow, but there is a mechanism for it. Effectively, we take we have a series of sources that provide authoritative taxonomic information. And on an approximately annual basis, we go back to them, we ask for their current list. We do our best to sort of glue them together from different sources where they relate to the same nodes. So we try and reconcile them where we can, but without any taxonomic, we do that computationally without any taxonomic expertise in part of the process. And then when we've got something that we think is complete, we start using that in production. Effectively, what that means is that before I get to that, the benefit of that is that it includes things like synonyms, right? So you can search a historic or current name and you'll get the other one. So it makes it much more straightforward. If you accept that our taxonomy is correct, which is a big if, then in theory, it gives you the whole history of observations of a species, regardless of what it was used to be called, even if it's had successive name changes. So conceptually, that's a really useful thing. It also enables things like, querying things that you didn't quite query. Like if you want to search the chordates, and actually gives you everything in the tree below the chordates as well, which is all our chordates by definition, but you wouldn't necessarily have searched for them. So there are benefits to this system. The challenge is actually gluing together taxonomies from different sources is hard. Not all authorities agree with each other. Who we choose and who we kick out itself is a difficult decision. Because it takes us so long to reconcile those problems, we're not agile, so people can't make their own edits to the system. And the way this is getting a little bit computational now, but basically that problem is so hard to solve for us in the Atlas that we literally do it once a year and cache it in every single system. There's no API for our taxonomy. And so what we tend to find then is we put it in a different system, it breaks that, we have to go back to the beginning, start again until we're done. We're finding that this system, while it's been successful in scaling and growing a system with 112 million records, and it's transferred well to other organizations as well, it is starting to creak as we get bigger and as disagreements become more evident between users, whether those are, from ecology and taxonomy or evolution or whatever, within the taxonomic community, whatever you want. Now, whether the solution to that is have multiple allowable taxonomies, whether it's that we need to curate our own taxonomies rather than just take things at face value, these are large questions that I don't have answers to, but we're taking that problem very seriously, because along with it underpins a lot of the other problems we have with data quality, for example. And so I'm not sure we're going to fix it next week, but over the next year, we're putting time and money into trying to solve it.
All right. Well, thanks again, Martin. We're now going to discuss the content of the presentation in a less formal setting. So we're going to end this Zoom webinar and switch to a Zoom meeting at the link posted in the chat now. The small groups, we might have small groups depending on how many people come, will be within the Zoom meeting. And so when you join the Zoom meeting, please introduce yourselves to each other very briefly, and then move on to discussing the ideas of the presentation. And this can last up to 30 minutes past the hour. So please join the next Zoom meeting immediately to facilitate the creation of these groups. All right, see you soon.